He was 19 years old. He had never left his planet. He had never fought in a real battle. He had held a lightsaber for exactly one afternoon. And within days of that afternoon, with his eyes closed and the targeting computer switched off, he fired the shot that destroyed the most powerful weapon in the history of the galaxy. Not because he was the strongest, not because he was the most trained, because he trusted something he could not explain, something that had been waiting inside him his entire life. This is the story of Luke Skywalker, and it is one of the most extraordinary stories the galaxy has ever produced. It begins not with Luke, but with the moment everything broke. A man who had been prophesied to save the galaxy instead burned it to the ground. A republic that had stood for 1,000 years fell in a single afternoon. The guardians of peace were hunted and killed. And in the wreckage of all of it, 2 children were born and immediately hidden from a darkness that did not yet know they existed. One of those children was Luke. Neither of them knew who they really were. Neither of them knew what was coming. To understand what Luke Skywalker became, you have to understand what he was born into. The galaxy was on fire. His father had just become the most feared being alive. And the man who had arranged all of it believed with complete certainty that 2 newborns could never threaten the empire he had just built from the ashes of everything that had come before. He was wrong, but it would take 19 years for the galaxy to find that out. In the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, the last sounds were the worst. Younglings who had never completed their training, children still learning to hold a lightsaber, ran toward the one figure they believed could save them. Anakin Skywalker, the chosen one, the being a Jedi prophecy had pointed toward for decades, stood at the center of that room and made the choice that would haunt the galaxy for a generation. He did not save them. He had already chosen another path. The man who had been Anakin Skywalker was becoming someone else entirely in those hours. Someone who would be known by a different name for the rest of his long and terrible life. The transformation had not happened all at once. It had been a process of years, of manipulation so patient and precise that it resembled care, of fears allowed to fester until they consumed the thing they were trying to protect. Anakin had been shown visions of his wife, Senator Padme Amidala, dying in childbirth. That fear, nurtured carefully by Palpatine over months of slow and incremental manipulation, had done what armies and dark side acolytes had never managed to do. It had broken Anakin Skywalker from the inside. And now Darth Vader stepped out of the ashes of everything Anakin had once loved and committed himself fully to the dark side and to the master who had promised him something no one else could offer: the ability to cheat death itself. The ability to save the one person left whom Anakin could not bear to lose. Padme Amidala had followed her husband to Mustafar, the volcanic hellscape where Anakin had gone to eliminate the last of the separatist leadership under Palpatine's direct orders. She had arrived, hoping to reach whatever remained of the man she loved, convinced that something of him must still be accessible, that the bond between them was stronger than whatever the Emperor had done to him. She was wrong about what was possible in that moment, though not wrong about what he had once been. Anakin, half consumed by Vader's emerging identity and unable to separate love from possession, saw her arrival through the darkest possible lens. When Obi-Wan Kenobi stepped out from where he had concealed himself aboard Padme's ship, Anakin concluded in his wounded paranoia that she had brought his former master to betray him. He reached out with the Force and squeezed, and Padme fell. And the last anchor Connecting Anakin Skywalker to anything resembling the light side of the Force was severed in that single terrible moment. What followed on the black shores of Mustafar was perhaps the most devastating duel in the history of the Jedi. Two men who had been brothers, who had saved each other's lives more times than either could count, who had been the Republic's most celebrated partnership for years, fought with everything they had on bridges above rivers of liquid fire. Obi-Wan Kenobi won, if winning was even the right word, for what happened on that black shore. He took the high ground and warned Anakin not to make the jump, and Anakin made it anyway, because Vader could not accept limitation, could not acknowledge any edge of his own power, not even a physical one standing right in front of him. The blade came and left Anakin burning on the volcanic banks, and Obi-Wan walked away, unable to deliver the killing blow to the man who had been his brother, carrying wounds that would never fully heal for as long as he lived. Palpatine arrived in time to save what remained of Anakin's body, and to place it into the black armor that would become the most recognizable silhouette in the galaxy's history. The breathing that followed, that mechanical respiration filling every room where Darth Vader stood, began in the moments after Mustafar, and the Emperor, standing over his newly suited apprentice, told him that Padme was dead, a lie built into a truth. Vader himself had killed her, though not with a blade. The scream that tore through the operating theater shook the walls and bent the medical equipment around it, and it was the last truly human sound that Anakin Skywalker ever made. After that, there was only the breathing, and the dark, and the long, cold purpose that the Emperor had always intended him for. But Padme had not died before giving birth. On Polis Massa, a sterile medical facility carved into an asteroid far from the chaos consuming the core worlds, the medical droids worked quickly as her body failed around her. The healers could find no physical cause for her decline. Her will to live had simply left her. She had seen Anakin become something she could not recognize, something that had tried to kill her with his own hands. And whatever force of spirit had been sustaining her gave way. But before the end, she gave the galaxy two things it did not yet know it would desperately need: a boy and a girl, born within minutes of each other in that cold and clean room while the Republic burned elsewhere. She named the boy Luke. She named the girl Leia. And then Padme Amidala, who had been Queen of Naboo and Senator of the Republic, and perhaps the only person who might have found a way to reach Anakin before the end, died at the age of 27. The medical droids would record the cause as a loss of the will to live. Some forms of grief have no other name. The decision about what to do with the children had to be made immediately. Senator Bail Organa of Alderaan had been present throughout, a witness to the birth and the death and the collapse of everything the Republic had once promised. Master Yoda and Obi-Wan Kenobi, the two surviving pillars of the Jedi Order's leadership, gathered in that austere facility to determine the fate of the twins, while the galaxy outside was still rearranging itself around Palpatine's new order. The Emperor could not know about the children. Vader could not know. If either of them discovered that Anakin Skywalker's children had survived, the children would be hunted, used as leverage, turned into weapons or destroyed depending on what they might represent to the dark side's designs. They needed to disappear. They needed to be separated, both for their safety and because placing both of them in the same location doubled the risk of discovery. Two Force-sensitive children in one place was twice the beacon. twice the signal that a sufficiently motivated search might detect, and there were people who would be very motivated to search. The decision was made quietly, in the way that decisions with enormous consequences are sometimes made, practically and without ceremony, because there was no time for ceremony and no one left to perform it. Leia would go with Bail Organa to Alderaan, raised as his adopted daughter, a princess of one of the most respected worlds in whatever remained of the galaxy's political order. Her identity would be entirely constructed, her origins a secret even from herself for years to come. She would grow up sheltered and educated and genuinely loved in a way that shaped her into something formidable through nurture rather than through raw force training. Through the particular kind of strength that comes from being raised by people who genuinely believe in the principles they espouse, Luke's path was different. The boy would go to Tatooine, to the Lars moisture farm at the edge of the Jundland wastes, to a man named Owen Lars, who was Anakin Skywalker's stepbrother and who had no love for Jedi or for the Force or for the wars they had brought to his doorstep. It was perhaps the last place in the galaxy anyone would think to look for a Jedi's son. Tatooine was a backwater world at the very outer edge of known space, controlled loosely by the Hutt crime syndicates, deliberately ignored by anyone with ambitions or power or access to anything better. It was perfect, in the grim way that only terrible choices can be perfect. Obi-Wan Kenobi would go too, though not to the farm itself. He would watch from a distance, from the desert, from the sand and the silence and the twin suns that set over the dunes every evening in a blaze of orange and gold. He would wait for whatever the Force intended. He would grow old waiting, and on that barren world, in a small house, half buried in the earth to escape the killing heat, a baby boy named Luke Skywalker would begin the first chapter of a life that neither he nor anyone watching him could yet imagine. Owen Lars was not a cruel man. This matters because it would have been easy to write him that way, easy to cast him simply as the obstacle standing between a legendary hero and his destiny. But Owen was something more complicated and more human than that simple role. He was a man who had watched the Jedi Order collapse and felt something close to relief, because the Jedi had taken from him in ways both direct and indirect, and he was done with what they represented. He had seen what the Force did to people he cared about. His stepbrother Anakin had been a Jedi, and Anakin was gone now in the most complete sense imaginable. Dead, or something worse than dead, present somewhere in the galaxy, in a suit of black armor, serving the Emperor who had destroyed everything the Republic ever was. Owen had met Obi-Wan Kenobi once before, years ago on Tatooine, and he had seen the way young Anakin looked at that old Jedi with something between reverence and desperate need. And he had seen nothing in that relationship but another way for the Force to take someone away. Now he was being handed a baby and told to raise him as a farm boy and to keep him away from anything that might awaken what was already sleeping inside him. Owen intended to do exactly that. He intended it completely and with his whole heart, because keeping Luke safe and ordinary felt like the only concrete thing he could do in the wreckage of an era that had claimed everyone else. The Lars homestead sat in a crater in the Tatooine desert, accessible via a ramp that descended from the open courtyard into the living quarters below the surface. It was dug into the ground deliberately to escape the savage heat of the binary suns that baked everything above the surface from before dawn until well after dark. Owen and his wife Beru lived there with the rhythms of moisture farmers, checking the evaporators at dawn, maintaining the evaporators that pulled what little water the desert air could offer, trading with the occasional merchant who passed through the territory. surviving with the quiet stubbornness of people who had decided that this particular patch of inhospitable ground was worth defending against everything the desert threw at it. Into this life came Luke Skywalker, infant and orphan, and secret heir to one of the most significant bloodlines in galactic history, who knew nothing of any of that, and regarded the twin suns with the same uncomplicated wonder that any baby might. Beru took to him immediately. She was warm in the way Owen was guarded, and she gave Luke the softness that balanced the harder edges of farm life. Between the two of them, the adults gave the boy everything a child genuinely needs in the early years: food and shelter, and the absolute certainty of being wanted. These are not small things. They are the foundations everything else is built upon, and Luke built well on them. He grew into a restless child, curious about everything, always asking questions that Owen did not always have the patience to answer, drawn especially to anything that moved through the air or had an engine attached to it. Tatooine had a kind of racing culture built around swoops and land speeders, and the Beggars Canyon area north of the Lars farm was famous locally as a proving ground for young pilots who wanted to test themselves against its narrow walls and treacherous turns. Luke found his way there often enough that Owen eventually stopped bothering to forbid it. Because a boundary you cannot enforce teaches children nothing useful. And Luke was already more stubborn than the Vaporators. What the boy could do with a speeder, with a T-16 Skyhopper, was remarkable even to people who had spent their entire lives around machinery. There was a naturalness to it, an ease with the controls that went beyond ordinary skill into something harder to name and harder to account for. He flew by instinct in a way that made experienced pilots slightly uncomfortable to watch, because it was too fluid and too confident and too consistently correct to be attributed entirely to practice and good reflexes. Owen noticed this. He did not discuss it. He pretended very deliberately that he had not noticed it, and he watched his step-nephew barrel through Beggars Canyon and said nothing about what it might mean or where it might lead. Luke made friends the way restless people do, by finding others who shared the same particular kind of dissatisfaction with where they had landed. His closest friend was Biggs Darklighter, the son of a wealthy Tatooine family with enough money and connections to secure Biggs an education off-world, a passage to the Imperial Academy that Luke could only look at from a distance with a hunger he tried not to let show. Biggs was everything Luke admired and privately envied, not from spite or smallness, but from a kind of longing that had no other shape. Biggs was already on his way out, already pointed toward the larger galaxy that Luke could only see as a suggestion on the horizon, when he stood at the edge of the Lars property and watched the suns go down, and felt the distance between himself and everything else that existed. They spent long evenings together in the kind of conversations that only teenagers at the absolute edge of the known universe can manage, enormous in scope and completely unfiltered, covering the rebellion that was beginning to build against the Emperor in whispers across 1,000 systems, the state of the galaxy, what they would do if they ever managed to get off this rock. Biggs left eventually, as he had always said he would. He got his commission and his assignment and his future. And Luke stood on Tatooine and watched him go and felt the distance between himself and the rest of the universe more sharply than he ever had. He was good enough to know exactly what he was missing. And that kind of knowledge is its own particular species of loneliness. The harvest seasons came and went. The moisture evaporators needed maintenance, and the Jawas occasionally raided the outer equipment, and the Tusken raiders moved through the deep desert in their unpredictable and dangerous patterns, and life on the Lars farm had the repetitive quality of survival rather than the forward motion of ambition. Owen needed Luke's help. This was genuine and not manipulative. The farm genuinely required more hands than two aging adults could provide without breaking down, and Luke's deferment from the academy another season was not a punishment so much as a practical reality that Owen dressed in practical language because he did not know how to dress it in honest language. The honest language would have required Owen to say that he was afraid. Afraid of what the Force would do to this boy, if given the opportunity to do anything at all. Afraid of what the galaxy would demand of a Skywalker once it knew one still existed. The Lars farm was a hiding place, and Owen was the lock on the door. And he kept that lock closed with every tool available to him, including the carefully maintained fiction that the next harvest was always just slightly more important than whatever it was Luke thought he needed from the world beyond Tatooine's twin horizons. Beru saw it differently. She was more honest with herself about what they were doing, and more honest about the limits of how long it could be sustained. She watched Luke stand at the edge of the courtyard on some evenings as the binary sunset colored the sky in shades of amber and rose, standing very still and looking out at nothing in particular, with an expression she recognized as something closer to grief than longing. And she understood that you cannot contain the ocean in a bowl. Whatever was inside that boy, whatever had been placed there by birth or by blood or by the Force that Obi-Wan had spoken about so carefully when he had delivered Luke to their doorstep all those years ago, it was too large for the farm to hold indefinitely. She did not argue with Owen about it, because arguing would have been a kind of cruelty toward a man who needed to believe he could protect the boy by keeping him small. Beru simply held the knowledge quietly and waited for the day when the choice would stop belonging to either of them. Obi-Wan Kenobi lived in the desert. He had established a small and simple dwelling in the rocky wastes of the Jundland territory, close enough to keep an eye on the Lars farm, far enough to maintain the fiction that he was merely a peculiar hermit called Ben, who was best left alone by the locals. Which is exactly what they did. The years were not kind to him in the way they are not kind to anyone who spends them in grief and solitude, and the particular weight of knowing that the worst thing you feared came true and that you could not prevent it. He had been a great Jedi Master, one of the finest swordsmen in the Order's long history, a diplomat and a warrior and a teacher who had given everything he had to the Republic and the Order and to Anakin Skywalker. And now he was a man in the desert talking to a ghost. He had learned from Yoda before their parting ways that Qui-Gon Jinn had found a way to persist beyond physical death, to maintain identity and consciousness within the Force rather than dissolving into it, and that this technique could be learned, and that communication with those who had passed on was genuinely possible. Obi-Wan spent years in the Tatooine desert working toward this, sitting in the early mornings before the heat became unbearable, reaching inward and outward at once, and Qui-Gon came to him eventually as promised. And those conversations in the deep silence of the desert nights were the closest thing to companionship the exile ever offered him. He also watched Luke, not intrusively, not constantly, but with the steady awareness of someone who has made a promise and has no intention of breaking it, regardless of how long it takes to be needed. There were moments over those years when the watching became something more direct. When Luke was still very small, there had been an incident in the deep desert that required Obi-Wan to move quickly and quietly, and to arrive before harm was done, and withdraw before anyone saw him clearly. He had also crossed paths with Owen once or twice over those long years, in ways that could not be gracefully avoided, and the conversations between them had been short and difficult, in the way that conversations between two people who disagree about something fundamental but cannot afford to fight about it, tend to be. Owen viewed Obi-Wan's presence on Tatooine as exactly the kind of proximity he had been trying to prevent. Obi-Wan understood Owen's position and respected the limits it imposed on him. They reached an unspoken understanding that held for almost 19 years, a kind of treaty of silence. And the Force moved through the arrangement with the patience of something that understood better than either man that events were always going to arrive in their own time, regardless of how carefully the waiting was managed. Luke Skywalker turned 19 in the year the Empire's ultimate weapon came online. The Death Star, a battle station the size of a small moon, capable of focusing enough energy to destroy an entire planet in a single discharge, had been under construction for nearly 2 decades, one of the most carefully guarded secrets in the galaxy. Whispered about in certain circles, reported on in fragments, but never confirmed, and never seen by most of the people it was ultimately intended to threaten. It was the Emperor's final answer to any political disagreement. It was the response to resistance. The Rebel Alliance had been building for years, gathering momentum from former Republic senators and military defectors and ordinary beings across thousands of worlds who had watched the Emperor's justice at close range and decided that any cost was worth paying to oppose it. They had been searching for a weakness in imperial power, for something they could actually use against a military machine of such overwhelming scale. Now they had found something. If they could survive long enough to deliver it to someone who could act on it. Princess Leia Organa of Alderaan was 19 years old, and already a senator, and already a spy for the Alliance, and already one of the most capable and determined individuals the rebellion possessed. She had grown up on Alderaan under Bail Organa's guidance, educated in politics and philosophy, and the kind of moral clarity that comes from being raised by people who genuinely live the principles they claim to believe. She had been given the technical readouts of the Death Star by Alliance agents who had sacrificed enormously to extract them, and she was carrying them toward Obi-Wan Kenobi on Tatooine when Darth Vader's Star Destroyer intercepted her ship in the Tatooine system. As Imperial stormtroopers breached the corridor and the fight became impossible to sustain, she made a decision that would change everything. She encoded her message and the technical readouts into the memory of a small astromech droid designated R2-D2 and sent him off the ship with the protocol droid C-3PO, and then she turned around and faced what was coming. Darth Vader came for her personally. He swept through the corridor with the cold, absolute authority of someone who has never in 20 years encountered a situation he could not dominate by force of will and the dark side's power. She did not flinch. She faced him with a composure so complete it looked like contempt, which it partly was. And when he ordered her taken, she went without giving him the satisfaction of witnessing whatever she actually felt. She had been carrying secrets and playing dangerous games since before most senators had learned the rules, and she was very good at it. But she was caught now, and the droids were somewhere on the desert below, and whether the plan could still work depended on 2 machines navigating the Tatooine wilderness long enough to reach someone who would know what to do with what they carried. R2-D2 and C-3PO escaped in a pod that the Empire let fall to the planet's surface without firing on it because their scanners showed no life forms aboard, which the droids technically were not. The pod landed in the Jundland wastes. C-3PO immediately declared the situation hopeless and proposed they each go in a different direction, which is what they did. And within a day the Jawas had collected them both and loaded them onto a sandcrawler, trundling its methodical way through the desert. The Jawas were traders in mechanical salvage, and they eventually stopped at the Lars moisture farm to sell what they had gathered. Owen came out to examine what was on offer, needing a translator droid and some kind of utility unit, and he bought C-3PO because he spoke 6 million forms of communication, and he bought R2-D2 because the little astromech's motivator read better than the alternative unit available. Luke was given the job of cleaning them up, which is how he came to discover the fragment of message that R2-D2 was cycling through on a short loop. A young woman in white, half visible in the hollow projection, speaking of someone named Obi-Wan Kenobi. "Help me," she said. "You are my only hope." Luke did not sleep that night, in the way that people do not sleep when something has caught on something deep inside them and will not let go. He had heard the name Obi-Wan Kenobi. He knew of a Ben Kenobi somewhere in the deep desert, an old hermit whose reputation among the locals ranged from eccentric to slightly dangerous, and who most people had the practical sense to avoid. He had never connected them before, he had never had reason to, but now the name was pulling at something he could not quite name, and he kept turning over the fragment of that face in the projection. The urgency in it, the immediate and undeniable reality of a person who needed help right now. He mentioned it at breakfast, and Owen's reaction was so rapid and so closed that it told Luke more than anything Owen actually said. There was something here that his uncle did not want him to find. The argument that followed was not a new argument in its bones. It was the same argument they had been having for years in different forms, dressed in different clothes each time, but arriving at the same place. Owen said next season. He always said next season. Luke went back to work and said nothing more, and at some point during the night, R2-D2 simply rolled out of the garage and headed off into the desert alone, because he had his mission and he had never intended to let a moisture farmer's garage be the end of it. Luke and C-3PO followed him at first light. The search led them into the rocky terrain where the Sand People moved. And when they found R2-D2, it was in the aftermath of a Tusken Raider attack that Luke had been knocked unconscious before he could do much about. When he came back to awareness, it was to the presence of an old man in worn robes crouching over him in the desert morning, who had apparently driven the raiders off with a sound that sent them scattering into the rocks. Ben Kenobi looked at Luke Skywalker for a long moment in the bright morning air. And whatever he felt in that look after all these years of watching from a distance, he had decades of practice at concealing. He simply helped Luke up and asked how he came to be out here. And when Luke mentioned the droid and the message and the name Obi-Wan Kenobi, the old man's eyes went somewhere very private for just a moment and then returned. "That is a name I have not heard in a long time," he said. Ben Kenobi's home was small and spare, and filled with a quality of stillness that Luke could not entirely account for. The old man moved through it with the easy deliberateness of someone who has refined their life down to only what is genuinely necessary and has made peace with everything else. He listened to R2-D2's full message once he had coaxed the little droid into playing it, and he sat with it for a moment in that particular way, that people sit with things they have been expecting without knowing exactly how or when they would arrive. Then he began to speak. He explained who Leia Organa was. He said that her father Bail had been a friend, that she was in danger, and that she had asked for his help. And then he looked at Luke and asked him to come to Alderaan, to help deliver what she carried to the people who needed it. What Ben Kenobi did not do in that moment was lie to Luke exactly. What he did was choose how much truth to offer, in what order, at what depth. He told Luke about his father. He said that Anakin Skywalker had been a Jedi Knight, a good friend, a brilliant pilot, a man who had served in the Clone Wars. He said that Anakin had been betrayed and murdered by Darth Vader. These were words arranged in a very particular way that were not technically false, and were also nowhere near the full truth of what had happened on Mustafar. He would explain later, when pressed much harder than he expected to be pressed, that it had been true from a certain point of view. It is worth sitting with this moment for a while, because it represents one of the most consequential silences in the history of the Skywalker family, and it came from a man who genuinely believed he was protecting Luke as much as he was protecting a truth. He did not know how to give to a 19-year-old boy who had just had his world upended. He also gave Luke his father's lightsaber. The blue blade hissed into existence in the desert afternoon, steady and certain, and Luke turned it in his hands with an instinct that nobody watching him could have mistaken for unfamiliarity. It was not a moment of learning something new. It was a moment of recognition. Luke's first impulse was to say no. He could not go to Alderaan. His uncle needed him for the harvest. He had responsibilities at the farm, obligations, people who depended on him. He said all of this, and Ben listened without arguing. And then he drove Luke home, and home was where the smoke was visible from a long way out. The Lars moisture farm was burning. Owen and Beru Lars were dead, killed by Imperial stormtroopers who had been tracking the trail of the droids, and who had done what the Empire did when it encountered resistance or inconvenience. There was nothing to be done at the farm. There was nothing to bury in any meaningful sense. Luke stood in front of what had been his home for all 19 years of his life, and understood with the sudden, absolute clarity that only catastrophic loss can produce, that there was nothing holding him here anymore. The harvest he had waited for was gone. Next season would never come. There was just the desert behind him and everything that lay ahead. He told Ben he wanted to come. He wanted to learn the ways of the Force. He wanted to become a Jedi Knight, like his father. Getting off Tatooine required a ship and a crew willing to take passengers to Alderaan without asking questions that would complicate things, which meant Mos Eisley. The spaceport was everything its reputation promised, and a few things it left out. It was a place of convergence for everyone who existed at the edges of legality and beneath the notice of anyone official. A marketplace for things that did not appear in licensed catalogs and people who preferred it that way. Ben moved through it with a calm authority that Luke found difficult to fully explain. A quality of presence that drew no particular attention, and yet seemed to part the crowds without effort. The kind of confidence that comes from knowing who you are in a situation that is trying very hard to make you uncertain. They found their way to a cantina that was dark and loud and smelled of a dozen different things and played music that had its own particular kind of relentless energy. And they found their pilot there at a table near the back. Han Solo was 29 years old and already managed to seem somehow older and younger than that at the same time. He had the kind of face that told you immediately it had seen things and had decided not to let them show, which is different from a face that has seen nothing. He was a smuggler and a pilot who moved cargo that was better not examined too closely between systems that were better not mentioned specifically, and he was good at his work in the way that people who have bet their survival on being good at something tend to become good at it. He had a Wookiee co-pilot named Chewbacca, 7 feet of ferocity and loyalty, who communicated in a complex system of growls and rumbles and roars that Han translated with the ease of a man who had been listening to the same voice for long enough that it had become a native language. His ship was the Millennium Falcon, a modified Corellian freighter that had been pushed through more repairs and alterations than its original design had ever anticipated. and that looked on the outside more or less exactly like what it had been through. It also, as Han explained with the particular pride of someone who has earned the right to this particular pride, held the record for the Kessel Run, 12 parsecs, which sounds like a distance until you understand that the Kessel Run involved navigating the edges of black holes and that the parsecs in question referred to the shortness of the route rather than the speed of the trip. And then you began to understand what the Falcon actually was beneath its battered exterior. They negotiated a price that was high, in the way that illegal transportation during an active Imperial search tends to be high, and they left Tatooine as the stormtroopers were closing in on Docking Bay 94, and the Falcon cleared the atmosphere with the kind of casual urgency that suggested this was not the first time Han Solo had left a planet slightly ahead of something that wanted to stop him. The jump to hyperspace pressed Luke back into his seat, and then there was the starfield of hyperspace and the hum of the ship around him and the enormous fact of everything that had happened to him in the last 24 hours, sitting there in his chest waiting to be processed. Ben set up a training remote, a small sphere designed to fire low-level stun blasts, and told Luke to put on a helmet with the blast shield down, eliminating his vision entirely, and to deflect the blasts using only the Force. Luke pointed out that this was objectively impossible. Ben said that the Force was his ally, that it was an energy field created by all living things, that it surrounded everything and penetrated everything and bound the galaxy together, and that if Luke would stop arguing for a moment and start feeling, he might discover that the possible extended further than he currently believed. Luke surprised himself. The remote fired and something moved through him without being fully willed. And the blade was there when it needed to be, and Ben's expression showed the quiet satisfaction of a man watching something arrive that he has been expecting for a very long time. What arrived instead of Alderaan was an asteroid field that should not have existed. They dropped out of hyperspace at the correct coordinates, and the planet was gone. An expanding cloud of rock and debris still spreading outward from a central absence that took several long seconds to understand for what it was. The Empire had used the Death Star to destroy Alderaan, one of the oldest and most peaceful worlds in the known galaxy. 2 billion people, gone in a single discharge of focused energy that Grand Moff Tarkin had authorized as a demonstration of Imperial resolve, fired, even after Leia had told them what they asked for, because the demonstration had been arranged regardless of what she said or did. Bail Organa was dead. Alderaan was gone. The reality of what the Empire was willing to do, the scale of violence it was prepared to commit to make a point about its own power, hung in the viewport as a field of rock and gas that used to be a world. They had very little time to absorb it. The Death Star pulled the Falcon into its docking bay with a tractor beam and the casual, overwhelming force of something that had never expected to encounter meaningful resistance. Han Solo said this was definitively over. Luke said they were not finished yet, because Leia was alive somewhere on this station, and the technical readouts were in R2-D2, and if they could get her out and get the data to the Alliance, there might still be a chance to do something that mattered with everything they had just witnessed. They bluffed their way through checkpoints in stormtrooper armor that fit neither of them correctly, and Chewbacca played prisoner and growled at everyone he passed with convincing menace. And R2-D2 sliced into the station's systems and pulled up the detention block, and Luke went to get Leia. Princess Leia Organa's first impression of her rescuer was unambiguous and delivered without hesitation. She looked at the boy in stormtrooper armor who had appeared in her cell and asked if he was a little short for a stormtrooper. It was the kind of dry assessment that comes from someone who has been managing impossible situations for long enough that another impossible situation registers primarily as data to evaluate. Then Han Solo came through the door, and the situation did not improve interpersonally. But they were moving, which was the element that mattered. The escape went sideways immediately and continued sideways through several corridors and a garbage chute and a trash compactor that sealed itself around them and began pressing inward with a slow, inexorable pressure. And at every stage, Luke was reaching through the Force towards something he could not yet name. An awareness that Ben was somewhere on this station, and that the awareness was becoming something he needed to pay attention to. Obi-Wan Kenobi had known there was a possibility of this encounter from the moment the tractor beam had pulled them in. He had moved toward it rather than away from it, because he had understood something about his own situation that Luke had not yet had time to arrive at. He was old. He was tired in ways that 20 years of exile and grief and solitary vigil in a desert produce in a person. He had done what he was asked to do in staying alive and in position long enough for Luke to find his path. And Luke had found it, and Obi-Wan Kenobi was ready for what came next. When Darth Vader's blade found his in one of the Death Star's corridors, and they stood facing each other for the first time since Mustafar, Obi-Wan did not step back from the duel. He stepped back from something much larger. He lowered his blade and closed his eyes and let the scarlet blade pass through him, and he became something that could not be contained by a body or ended by a weapon. He told Luke to run. Luke, watching from down the corridor, saw the robe settle empty to the floor and understood that something impossible had just happened, and he could not run yet. He could only stand there with the grief hitting him. And then he ran, because Ben's voice was still there, telling him to go, telling him that it was all right, and that he would always be with him. Luke did not understand it. He wept for it on the Falcon while they shot their way clear of the Death Star's escort, and Han pulled off things with the Falcon that no ship of its size and condition had any right to be capable of, and they jumped to hyperspace and left it all behind. The Rebel Alliance base on Yavin 4 was carved into the jungle. Ancient stone temples converted into hangars and command centers and living quarters for people who maintained a constant awareness that they could be found at any time and were perpetually ready for it. When the Falcon arrived, Luke felt the weight of what they were carrying for the first time in concrete terms. The technical readouts in R2-D2's memory had been what everything else was for. The analysis that the base's team ran on them produced one finding of significance. There was a thermal exhaust port, exactly 2 meters in diameter, that led directly to the main reactor. A precise shot delivered into that port would trigger a chain reaction capable of destroying the station from the inside. The shot would need to be made at the end of a narrow trench run along the Death Star's surface under full defensive fire by a pilot capable of hitting a 2-meter target at attack speed, while everything the station could bring to bear was trying to kill them. And it needed to be done before the Death Star came into firing position on Yavin 4 and did to this moon what it had done to Alderaan. The window was measured in minutes, and the minutes were running. Luke volunteered without deliberation, not from the thoughtless bravado of someone who does not understand what they are signing up for, but from the clear-eyed awareness of someone who understands exactly and has decided anyway. He had lost Ben. He had watched Alderaan die. He had been holding a lightsaber for 3 days and had received the rough equivalent of one afternoon's Force instruction. None of that changed the calculation. There was no one better positioned, and the thing had to be done. And he was the person standing there with the skill and the Force connection to attempt it. The briefing was quick. The pilots climbed into their ships, Biggs Darklighter was there, his face carrying everything they needed to say to each other between one look and the next, and they exchanged about 6 seconds of that look, and then the ships launched, and the battle began. The Battle of Yavin was the kind of engagement that becomes legend, not because it was the largest or most complex, but because of what it represented, and what it cost, and what it proved about what was possible. The Death Star's surface swarmed with guns, and the TIE fighter escorts came out in numbers, and the initial attack runs went badly in the way that first contact with an objective of this scale always goes badly for the side with fewer ships and less armor. Rebel pilots died in quick, silent explosions against the gray hull of the station, one after another. Each loss a voice gone from the comm channel. Biggs died. Luke heard his voice cut off in the middle of a sentence and felt the silence it left as a specific and immediate absence. A hole in the world where a person had been. Wedge Antilles took damage severe enough to force him to break off. By the time Luke was the last pilot positioned to attempt the trench run, the Death Star was seconds from firing range on Yavin 4, and Darth Vader was behind him in a TIE Advanced, closing the gap with the focused precision of the greatest pilot of the previous generation. 2 more Rebel pilots were lost to Vader in the final approach. Luke was alone in the trench, with Vader closing behind him, and the exhaust port ahead, and the targeting computer still live, and the weight of 2 billion dead on Alderaan, and everyone who had died today sitting in the air around him. He heard Ben's voice. Not a memory, not an echo. A voice, steady and present, and entirely clear, telling him to use the Force, telling him to trust it. The targeting computer was still active, designed by the Alliance's engineers for exactly this moment, representing hours of analysis and calculation. He reached out and switched it off. Something in Ben's voice was right. Something in the Force itself was saying the same thing. He was his father's son, and his father had been the greatest natural pilot the Jedi Order had ever known. And Luke Skywalker had been flying on instinct his entire life, and he knew what instinct felt like in his body, and he trusted it. He closed his eyes, and he let the Force move through him the way it had moved through him in the garbage compactor when he needed to reach R2, the way it had moved through him in the Falcon's hold with the blast shield down, the way it had moved through him every time he flew through Beggar's Canyon on Tatooine and found the line through the rock that was too narrow to be found by looking. He fired. The blast went in. The reactor received it, and the chain reaction built through the Death Star's infrastructure like a wave. And Luke was already pulling up, already climbing away from the surface, and then away from the explosion itself as it built behind him into something that lit the space above Yavin 4 like a second sun. The Death Star became light. The light expanded and thinned, and the station was gone, and Vader's TIE fighter was tumbling away into deep space, knocked clear by a shot from Han Solo, who had come back. Han Solo, the man who did not believe in causes and who had taken his payment and had every reason and intention to leave, had come back into the system in the Falcon at the last possible moment and made the shot that bought Luke the second he needed. The comm channel erupted. Pilots who had survived. Voices from the base below. The sound of hundreds of people simultaneously understanding that something that should have been impossible had just happened, and that the impossible had consequences, and that those consequences were only beginning to make themselves clear. The ceremony in the Yavin 4 temple was brief and genuine, and carried the particular emotional quality of people who had just survived, something they had genuinely not been certain they would survive. General John Dodonna stood before the assembled alliance. Princess Leia hung medals around the necks of Luke Skywalker and Han Solo, while Chewbacca stood beside them and was not similarly decorated, which he noted. Luke stood there with the medal and the sound of hundreds of voices around him, and felt both the weight of what had been accomplished and the specific absences of Ben Kenobi and Biggs Darklighter pressing against the celebration, the way that losses press against joy when both are present in the same moment. He had been a farm boy in the desert yesterday morning. He was standing in a jungle temple being celebrated as the hero of the Rebel Alliance this morning. The Force had moved very quickly once it finally started moving. He could still hear Ben's voice from the moment before the shot. He did not know what all of it meant yet. He knew that his life had changed faster than understanding could keep pace with, and that the understanding was going to have to catch up on its own time. The Alliance would not stay on Yavin 4. The Empire's ability to locate and destroy its bases had been amply demonstrated, and the destruction of the Death Star, while extraordinary and decisive, had not ended Imperial power. It had wounded and enraged the most powerful military machine the galaxy had ever seen, which was in some ways more dangerous in the immediate term than the situation before the battle. Darth Vader was alive. The Emperor was alive. The fleets and armies and administrative infrastructure of Imperial control across thousands of worlds were entirely intact. What had been destroyed was not a weapon, but an idea. The idea that resistance was futile. The idea that there was no point in fighting because Imperial power was too absolute to challenge. That idea was now demonstrably false, and the evidence of its falseness was traveling at the speed of Imperial communications across the galaxy, which meant that every being who had been quietly hoping someone would do something now knew that someone had done something, and that it had worked. Luke Skywalker wore his new fame inside the Alliance with the awkwardness of a young person who is considerably more comfortable with action than with the reception of praise for it. He was promoted to commander and given a squadron to lead, which he took seriously in the way he took everything seriously, because the people in the squadron were real, and the things they were being asked to do were real, and Luke had already watched enough people die for one lifetime. He threw himself into the work with an intensity that alarmed some of his commanding officers and reassured others. He flew every mission he could qualify for. He pushed himself in the cockpit past what most pilots considered reasonable, and found that the Force kept extending the edge of the possible just far enough ahead of him that he never quite reached a ceiling. Wedge Antilles, who had survived Yavin, and who was quietly becoming one of the Alliance's most reliable and gifted pilots, became his most consistent wingman, and between them they began assembling out of the best flyers. The Alliance had a unit that would eventually be known as Rogue Squadron. He also began trying, in whatever quiet moments existed between missions, to understand what Ben Kenobi had started teaching him. He had almost nothing concrete to work from. A few hours of conversation in a desert hut, a training session with a remote in the Falcon's hold, the moment in the trench when he switched off the targeting computer and felt the Force move through him like a current finding its course. These were fragments without a structure to place them in. He meditated, or attempted to, sitting in whatever quiet space was available on whatever base or ship the Alliance was currently using, and reaching inward toward the thing that had moved through him when he needed it most. He could feel it like a current beneath still water, enormous and consistent, and not quite obedient to any approach he had yet found. Ben came to him sometimes in those sessions, or something that felt like Ben, a presence at the edge of consciousness that was warm and patient, and occasionally said something useful in a voice that was familiar rather than startling. Luke did not yet have the framework to fully understand Force ghosts. He knew that the contact helped, and he held on to it. The months following Yavin found the Alliance living the way it had always lived, moving through safe houses and hidden installations and temporary encampments across the galaxy, never settling long enough to be found, always preparing for the next engagement while evacuating from the last one. The Empire responded to the Death Star's destruction with the particular fury of a regime that has been publicly humiliated and needs to demonstrate that humiliation carries consequences. They deployed resources with an intensity that gave the Alliance no comfortable space to work from. Luke flew cover on evacuation runs and extraction missions and escort operations where the objective was always to get out alive with as few losses as possible. He got better at it, at a pace that was difficult to attribute entirely to experience. There was something else there, something that the Force provided when he opened himself to it rather than trying to control it. A sense of what was coming before it arrived, a feel for the right move before it was consciously calculated. He noticed it. He kept it to himself. He did not yet have the vocabulary to explain it, and the people around him did not need an explanation. They just needed him to keep doing it. Han Solo remained with the Alliance through all of this in a way that he kept framing to himself as temporary. He had taken his reward after the Battle of Yavin, collected the credits that had been the stated purpose of the whole Alderaan detour, and he had used most of it to pay off the debts that had been accumulating with Jabba the Hutt at a rate that had become genuinely dangerous. He should have left then. He had every reason to leave. He kept not leaving. He told Chewbacca that he was still evaluating the situation and that leaving at the wrong moment could be costly, and that he would make his decision when the time was right. Chewbacca communicated his assessment of this reasoning with the eloquent economy that long partnership produces. Luke liked Han in the way you like someone who is much more than they claim to be. And he was wise enough not to push him on any of it, because pressing Han Solo on things he was not ready to examine produced nothing useful and created friction around the Falcon, which was too important to the Alliance's operational capacity to jeopardize. Leia's relationship with Han was combustible in the way that two extremely capable and equally stubborn people's relationships tend to be combustible when neither of them is prepared to say the obvious thing. Luke watched it and said very little about it, and occasionally redirected things when they got close to the edge of becoming operationally disruptive. Somewhere out there, the Empire was tightening its grip, probing for weakness, tracing every signal that might lead it back to the people who had destroyed its greatest weapon. Luke Skywalker, commander, Jedi student, and the son of a secret he did not yet carry, flew his patrols and trained when he could, and held the pieces of what his life had become, and waited for the Force to tell him what came next. It always did. He had destroyed the Death Star. He had become the hero of the rebellion. And then a creature pulled him off his speeder in a blizzard and hung him from a cave ceiling by his ankles. This is where part 2 begins. Not with triumph, with ice and pain and a dead man's voice telling him to go somewhere he had never heard of. Because Luke Skywalker's story does not pause for celebration. It just keeps asking more of him. The Empire had not stopped. The Emperor was not finished. And everything that had happened so far, the shot, the medal, the moment the Death Star became light, was only the beginning of what it was going to cost to actually win. The Alliance eventually found its permanent base on a world that recommended itself precisely because of how little anyone wanted to be there. Hoth was an ice planet, at the edge of a remote system, a place of glaciers and temperatures that killed exposed personnel in minutes without full thermal protection. Echo Base was carved into the glacial interior, filled with the equipment of rebellion. And it could not hold forever. Nothing the Alliance built was intended to hold forever. The point was always to hold long enough and then move. Luke Skywalker flew the perimeter patrols and scouted the glacial flats and reported nothing. And on one of those patrols, the Wampa found him. The creature was everything its environment had produced over thousands of years of brutal evolution. White-furred and massive and built for cold that killed everything else, it struck from behind with the efficiency of something that had been doing this its entire life, and carried Luke to a cave and froze him into the ceiling by his ankles, which is where he regained consciousness. He was upside down in the dark, with the temperature pressing in from every surface and his speeder destroyed in the snow somewhere behind him, and no one who knew his location. His lightsaber had fallen into the snow below him, just beyond reach. He closed his eyes and reached with the Force in the way he had been practicing in meditation for months, reaching not with his arm, but with something that had no physical dimension. And he felt the lightsaber, and he pulled. The blade came to his hand, and he cut himself free and took the Wampa's arm when the creature came for him and pushed himself out into the storm. The temperature outside Echo Base at night without full gear was not survivable for long. Luke was already hypothermic and getting worse, and he went down in the white. He saw Obi-Wan Kenobi in the snow, standing in the Hoth night in his desert robes as though the killing cold did not apply to him, calm and entirely present, the way Force ghosts are present when they intend to be heard. Ben said one word, Dagobah. He said it with the weight of something that had been held for precisely this moment and no other. Then he was gone, and Luke was in the snow, and Han Solo found him. Han Solo, who did not believe in causes, went out into a Hoth night that his instruments told him was unsurvivable, and he found Luke, and he cut open his tauntaun and placed Luke inside the carcass to preserve body heat long enough for a rescue team to locate them. Luke woke up in the Echo Base medical bay to Han's face, explaining what had happened with the casual, matter-of-fact brevity of someone describing a routine task rather than the thing it actually was. Luke filed this next to all the other evidence he had been quietly accumulating about who Han Solo was, beneath the version Han preferred to present. The Imperial walkers came with the morning. The probe droid that had been scanning the Hoth system had found what it was looking for, and the full Imperial response was moving across the ice flats toward Echo Base in AT-AT walkers, massive armored quadrupeds whose hull armor the Alliance's snowspeeder blasters could not penetrate in a conventional attack run. The evacuation began immediately under fire because there was no other option. Luke led the speeder attack and worked out that tow cables could trip the walkers by tangling their legs. And he brought one down, and then his own speeder took a hit, and he went into the ice and got himself out and used a grappling cable to get up inside the fallen walker's belly and threw a thermal detonator and rolled clear ahead of the explosion. He fought until the last evacuation transport was away, and then he found his X-Wing and left Hoth not with the fleet but alone, navigating toward a destination that only he and Ben Kenobi and a swamp planet's coordinates knew anything about. Dagobah received him the way it received, everything that landed on it uninvited, with deep mud and tangled vegetation and a density of life that pressed against Force sensitivity like a warm and ancient hand. The X-Wing sank into a swamp upon landing, and Luke and R2-D2 made it to solid ground by a margin that counted as success without looking like it. The world was alive in every direction, layered and ancient, and the Force moved through it differently than it moved through open space, thicker and more present, as though the planet itself was aware of everything that touched it. Luke set up a camp and began thinking about how to search for one specific being on a world with no navigation data and no obvious landmarks beyond more swamp. A creature found him at the camp that first night. Small and green and ancient in the way that living things become ancient when age has stopped marking them the way it marks most beings. Enormous eyes and an oddly deliberate manner and a cheerful disregard for the concept of other people's belongings. Going through Luke's supplies with interested curiosity while Luke asked it to stop, which it did not. And while Luke asked what it wanted, which it answered, with questions of its own. It had the syntax of something that had thought in a different structure for so long that Basic had become a second language, even after 800 years of fluency. It said it knew what Luke was searching for. Luke said he was looking for a Jedi Master named Yoda. The creature's enormous eyes did something complicated, and it invited Luke to have a meal. And Luke was cold and hungry and on an unfamiliar swamp world, and he went. The home was small and old and worn in the way that things worn by long and constant use eventually become part of their owner. Everything in it had been present for a very long time. They ate, and the creature talked and probed and asked questions with a gentleness that was also a form of structured assessment, reaching into Luke's motivations and understanding and patience by routes so gradual that the method was easy to miss as a method at all. Luke answered with the impatience of someone who needed to arrive at a specific point, and the creature listened carefully to everything, including the impatience. By the end of the meal, something in Luke's understanding had adjusted slightly. He heard Ben's voice at the edge of the room, barely there, confirming what he was beginning to sense. He was already sitting with the master he had traveled to find. Yoda had been watching him since he landed, had made his assessment from the first moment Luke had walked into the swamp, and was now deciding whether the assessment was sufficient. Luke looked at the creature across the fire and understood. The meeting had already happened. The only question still open was what Yoda had decided. Yoda was 900 years old. He had been training Jedi for 800 of those years, which is a duration that becomes genuinely difficult to hold in the mind when you sit with it fully. He had trained Dooku. He had trained hundreds of others whose names the wider galaxy had never heard. Competent and good Jedi, who had lived and died in service to the Order without generating the particular kind of story that gets remembered. He had watched the Order he had helped build fall in a single afternoon. He had made choices before and during Order 66 that he had spent 20 years on Dagobah examining and had not yet finished examining. He had reservations about Luke Skywalker. Not about the power, which was evident and extraordinary, drawing from the same deep current in the Force that ran through the Skywalker line like a river through bedrock. The reservations were about everything else. The fear that was real and present and close to the surface. The anger underneath the fear. The impatience that was not affectation but character. These were not disqualifying considerations. They were the things the training needed to reach most urgently, which is not the same as reasons not to train. Yoda had decided before the soup was finished. He would train Luke Skywalker, but he would train him properly, which meant honestly. The training that followed was not primarily about technique, though the technique was present and necessary. Yoda made Luke run through the swamp terrain while maintaining Force focus, because a Jedi who can access the Force only in stillness has learned the easier half of the lesson and skipped the part that matters in an actual crisis. He had Luke carry him on his back through the obstacle courses that the landscape provided, which served the dual purpose of physical conditioning and continuous force practice, while also being, Yoda suspected, slightly humbling for someone who had already been celebrated as a hero. He talked about the dark side with a precision that made clear he was not using it as rhetorical shorthand. The dark side was a genuine and accessible thing, not a metaphor for bad choices or destructive impulses, but a specific aspect of the Force that was faster and easier to channel than the light side because it ran on what living beings already carried in abundance: fear, anger, the desperate love that becomes possession when something threatens what it loves. These were not weaknesses to be ashamed of. They were doorways. And they were doorways that opened from this side with almost no effort at all, which was exactly what made them worth understanding thoroughly. Yoda had watched extraordinary beings walk through those doorways, believing they were choosing power, and finding instead that the power had chosen what it would cost them. He described it without drama and with the weight of 9 centuries of watching. Then Luke went into the cave. It was a place in the Dagobah roots where the dark side had been concentrated long enough that it had taken on a physical quality, a wrongness that pressed against Force sensitivity the way cold presses against exposed skin, persistent and impossible to ignore. Yoda told him he would not need his weapons. Luke carried them anyway, because there are things that can be told and things that have to be discovered at first hand. And this was in the second category. Inside the cave, he found a vision of Darth Vader, or something that was Darth Vader in all the ways that the cave intended. They fought. Luke's blade took Vader's helmet off. The face inside was Luke's own face. He walked out of the cave, and Yoda said nothing, because the cave had said what needed saying, and adding words would only dilute it. Luke carried the image for the rest of his life and returned to it regularly, not to punish himself with it, but because it was one of the clearest things he had ever been shown about what was at stake in his own choices and who he was actually fighting. He was making genuine progress. Not as quickly as he believed, which is the condition of everyone who is making genuine progress at anything difficult, but measurably and consistently. The Force was settling into him differently than it had when he arrived. The connection was deepening in the way that consistent practice deepens a channel, cutting a path that becomes more open with each passing. He was beginning to understand the why of what he could do rather than just the what of it, which is the difference between someone who has learned a skill and someone who has internalized a practice. And then the vision arrived, not sought and not anticipated, breaking through the middle of a training exercise with the force of something the Force had decided he needed to receive immediately. He felt them through the Force while lifting stones in the Dagobah undergrowth. Specific presences, recognizable not by name, but by the particular quality of being that belongs to one person and not any other. Han was there. Leia was there. The feeling was pain, real and escalating, coming from somewhere cold and enclosed and metallic, and it was getting worse, and Luke could not continue lifting stones while that was happening. He stopped. He told Yoda what he had felt. He said he had to go to them. Yoda did not argue with this in the way of someone who thinks argument will work. He said what was true, that this was exactly the test, that this precise kind of urgency was the mechanism by which capable beings with extraordinary Force gifts arrived at places they could not come back from. Ben's voice came into the air around them, asking Luke to complete the training, saying there was another, if Luke failed, by which he meant the galaxy had other avenues available if Luke was insufficient to what was ahead. Luke interpreted this as permission to try. He understood some of what was being said and was wrong about another part of it. and neither Yoda nor Ben corrected the part he was wrong about, because the full truth was one he would have to arrive at himself. He went anyway. He went because they were suffering, and because he believed what he had learned was enough, and because he could not make himself stay. Yoda watched him go and said nothing more about it. What Darth Vader had arranged on Cloud City was the specific shape of a trap designed around one characteristic. Luke Skywalker could not let people he loved suffer when he believed he could do something about it. Vader had known this. He had sensed Luke on Hoth and had arranged everything that followed in the architecture of a mechanism with one output: the capture of Han Solo and Leia Organa through Lando Calrissian's coerced cooperation, the carbonite, the handover to the bounty hunter. All of it was scaffolding to produce one thing: a room where a conversation could happen. Luke flew into Bespin and walked into the carbon freezing chamber looking for his friends, and found the trap instead. And Darth Vader stepped out of the shadows, and the duel began. The duel was everything the Yavin trench run was not. The trench run had been a moment of clarity, of the Force moving cleanly through Luke at the exact instant when it was needed. Cloud City was a sustained experience of being methodically outmatched by someone who had been doing this for 20 years, and who also wanted something other than Luke's death. Vader drove him from chamber to chamber, and out onto a gantry above a reactor shaft, falling away into Bespin's open sky below. And he used the Force as much as the blade, wearing Luke down rather than overwhelming him quickly, measuring what was there against what was needed. Luke fought back with everything he had learned. It was not enough, not even close to enough. The blade took his right hand, the same hand the cave vision had shown him using, and Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber, the one Obi-Wan had given him in the desert, fell away into the shaft and was gone. And then Vader spoke. He said the words that reorganized everything Luke thought he understood about his own existence, about Obi-Wan's story, about the name that had been given to him as a gift, and was actually a partial truth arranged to protect him from what the full truth would have done to him at the wrong age and moment. He said, "I am your father." Luke refused it. He screamed that it was not true. Vader said quietly that he knew the truth, that Luke had always known it somewhere beneath the architecture of what he had been told, that he could feel it in the Force between them. Luke held onto the gantry above the drop and tried to hold onto the structure of his life at the same time. Ben had given him Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber. Ben had said that Anakin had been betrayed and murdered by Darth Vader. He had said these two things in sequence, and Luke had completed the construction himself, filling in the gap between them with the most available interpretation, and the gap had in fact contained an entirely different truth that Obi-Wan had not been able to bring himself to say. The man who had burned the Jedi Temple and hunted survivors and choked Padme Amidala and served the Emperor who destroyed Alderaan. That man shared blood with Luke. That man was the father whose lightsaber Luke had been carrying. Luke let go of the gantry. He fell through Cloud City's internal structure and was caught by an emergency ventilation shaft that slowed the descent enough to deposit him on a sensor array below the city's main body, hanging in the open sky of Bespin, with the wind pulling at him and barely alive and his hand gone, and the revelation sitting in him with the specific gravity of something that changes everything it touches. He reached through the Force with the only thing he had left. Not strength or precision, but something raw and directionless, reaching the way a drowning person reaches toward shore, and he reached toward Leia. She heard it, not the words, because there were no words, but the presence the particular quality of Luke that she had known since Yavin and that she would always know, reaching toward her from somewhere very close and very wrong. She turned the falcon around. She came back for him. He was pulled inside, and R2-D2 had what was needed for the immediate wound, and they jumped to hyperspace and left Bespin behind. The medical frigate fitted Luke with a prosthetic hand so precisely engineered it replicated the function of what he had lost almost exactly, and covered it in synth skin so that from the outside it looked unchanged. He stood at the observation window afterward, looking out at the fleet and at Lando and Chewbacca departing on the Falcon to begin the search for Han, and he turned his new hand over in his old one and thought about what the last hours had given him and taken from him and left behind. R2-D2 was beside him. Leia was beside him. The fleet was out there, battered and present and still moving, because stopping was not available as an option. Somewhere in the galaxy, Han Solo was frozen, and Yoda was waiting on Dagobah. And the man who had just told Luke a truth that redrew the map of his entire life was out there in the dark in his black armor, and Luke Skywalker was 20 years old. And what came next was going to require everything he had and some things he had not yet found. The plan to rescue Han Solo was assembled across months by people who had every reason to assume it would kill them, and who planned it anyway because Han was one of theirs, and that was simply what you did. Leia went first into Jabba's palace on Tatooine, disguised as a bounty hunter delivering Chewbacca as a prize, and she freed Han from the carbonite in the night, while Jabba's court slept. They were caught. Leia was taken as Jabba's slave, and Han was kept as a trophy, and the situation was approximately as bad as it could be when Luke Skywalker walked through the front door. He had changed in the months since Bespin in ways that were visible before he said a word. He wore black now, a practical choice that nonetheless carried a weight. He moved differently, with a quietness that had not been there before. He spoke to Jabba without the deference that Jabba's position and power were designed to produce in people. And when Jabba refused and dropped him into the rancor pit, he killed the rancor and waited to see what came next. What came next was the Sarlacc barge at the Great Pit of Carkoon. And what happened at the Sarlacc barge became one of the more efficient sequences of the entire war, with Luke's lightsaber arriving via R2-D2, and everything resolving in a span of minutes that left Jabba dead and his barge burning, and Han alive in the desert sunlight. They went to Dagobah. Luke knew he needed to go before anything else. There was a conversation that could not wait any longer, and a teacher he had not returned to since the vision had pulled him away. And something in the Force was telling him that the window for this was closing. What he found on Dagobah was Yoda dying, 900 years old, and the body finally giving way at last, and Yoda himself entirely at peace with this, in the way that beings are at peace with things they have long understood were coming. He told Luke that his training was complete, that he needed nothing more from Yoda's living instruction. He told Luke there was one more thing he had to face before he could be a Jedi. He said, Vader. And then he said, when Luke pressed him, that what Luke had suspected about his father was true. And then he said there was another Skywalker, the meaning of which Obi-Wan had been keeping for this moment. Yoda closed his eyes and became one with the Force, and the physical body was gone. Luke sat in the small home where an ancient being had waited for him for 2 decades, and then given him everything he had to give. And he was alone with it. Obi-Wan came. He came as he had come before, as a presence that was warm rather than cold. And he spoke honestly for the first time about Anakin Skywalker, about what had happened on Mustafar and what Darth Vader was and what the two designations shared. He explained about Leia, that she was Luke's twin sister, separated at birth, given to Bail Organa and raised as his daughter in the hope that both of them could be preserved for a future the galaxy might still be able to offer them. Luke took this in slowly. He thought about what it meant and what it changed and what it didn't. And what he felt when he thought about it was something that had always been almost true, becoming completely true, a recognition rather than a surprise. He had always known Leia was something specific to him. The Force had been trying to tell him that from their first meeting. The plan to attack the Death Star's successor, the second battle station that the Empire had been constructing above the forest moon of Endor, fell into place around the intelligence that its shield generator was on the moon's surface and that a small strike team on the ground could disable the shields long enough for the fleet to make its attack run. Luke went to Endor with the team. He helped make contact with the Ewoks, the small indigenous species of the moon's forest floor, whose relationship to the Force was unorthodox but genuine, and whose knowledge of their terrain was about to become the most tactically significant factor in the entire engagement. He was also aware, from the moment they landed, that Darth Vader was on the moon. He could feel him through the Force, the way you feel something enormous before you see it. And he knew that Vader could feel him back. And he knew that as long as both of them were on the same planet, the Emperor would know exactly where Luke was. He turned himself in. He surrendered to Imperial forces and asked to be taken to Vader. And Vader came. And they spoke on the moon's surface, in the particular way that two people speak, when both of them know that a great deal is happening beneath the level of what is being said. Luke told Vader that he could feel the conflict in him, that there was still good in him, that he believed it, absolutely. Vader said nothing that contradicted this, which was itself a kind of answer. He took Luke to the Emperor's throne room aboard the Death Star, which was not yet operational but was close, and the Emperor sat in his chair and looked at Luke with the specific satisfaction of a man who has had a plan in motion for a very long time and believes he is watching it arrive at its intended destination. The Emperor wanted Luke to strike him down in anger. The calculus, as Palpatine had arranged it, was elegant in the way of things designed by someone who had spent decades learning what made people fail. If Luke struck him down in anger and Vader's presence, he would be taking his first step toward the dark side at the very moment of what seemed like victory. If he refused and watched his friends die in the battle unfolding outside the viewport, the grief and helplessness would be the same doorway through a different entrance. Either way, the Emperor intended to have Luke Skywalker. He said so with the patience of someone who genuinely believes in the arrangements he has made. Luke heard everything and understood the shape of the trap and still felt the pull of it. Because knowing what a trap is does not make it stop being a trap. It only means you know what is happening to you while it is happening. Vader ignited his blade, and the duel began. And this one was different from Cloud City, because Luke was different. He fought with a discipline that had not been there before, not trying to win but trying not to lose, holding himself back from the anger that Palpatine was trying to feed, aware every moment of how close the edge was and how much it wanted him to step over it. And then he felt Leia. Through the Force, through the bond he had not yet been told they shared in words, but that the Force had been demonstrating for years. He felt her on the moon below, in danger, and for a single moment something cracked open, and the anger came through. and his blade came down on Vader's, with everything behind it. He drove Vader back. He took his hand. Vader went down on one knee, and the Emperor rose from his chair. And Luke stood above the father he had been told was dead, and looked at the hand lying at the end of his own arm, the mechanical hand that covered the place where Vader had taken his hand at Cloud City. And he understood what the cave had been trying to tell him all along. He threw his lightsaber away. He told the Emperor he would not fight. Not then. Not on those terms. Not to serve a trap that had been designed before he knew it existed. The Emperor's patience broke at that, and the lightning came. Force. Lightning in quantities designed not to wound but to destroy, and Luke went down under it and had no answer for it, and no way to stop it except to absorb it. And he was dying on the floor of the Emperor's throne room, calling for his father, when Darth Vader made the choice that the prophecy had always pointed toward, and that no one who had watched him for 20 years would have believed was still available to him. Anakin Skywalker reached through everything that Darth Vader had been and lifted the Emperor above his head and walked to the shaft and threw him in. The lightning that had been aimed at Luke tore through the life support systems of the suit, keeping Anakin alive. He knew what he had done. He walked toward his son. Luke would not leave him. He would not leave the man who had just saved his life at the cost of his own, not even with the battle still raging and the Death Star beginning to fail around them. Not because of who Vader had been, but because of who Anakin Skywalker had just chosen to be in his last minutes. He carried him toward the shuttle. Anakin asked Luke to help him with the helmet, to let him see his son with his own eyes before the end. And Luke took the helmet off, and Anakin Skywalker looked at Luke Skywalker with the eyes of a man who had come back from somewhere most people do not come back from. And he said that Luke had been right about him. There had still been good. Then he was gone, and Luke carried him onto the shuttle and flew out of the Death Star as it came apart behind him. The celebration on the forest moon that night was genuine in a way that large public celebrations rarely achieve, because the people gathered there had been genuinely afraid this would not happen, and were genuinely grateful that it had. The Emperor was dead. The second Death Star was gone. Vader was gone. The alliance of species and soldiers and pilots and ordinary beings who had decided to fight rather than accept had done something that the Empire's own mythology had spent years insisting was impossible. Luke stood at the edge of the celebration fire and looked into the trees and saw three figures standing in the firelight that only he could see. Obi-Wan Kenobi, whole and at peace. Yoda, smiling in the particular way that Yoda smiled at things that had resolved the way he had hoped they would, despite the obstacles. And Anakin Skywalker, young as he had been before Mustafar and before the armor, looking at his son across the fire with an expression that had no simple name. Luke looked at them for a long time. Then he turned back to the celebration. What came after the Battle of Endor was not, as many beings across the galaxy had believed it would be, an immediate restoration of what had existed before. The Emperor was dead, but the Empire was not. Not all of it, not at once. Grand Moffs and fleet admirals and regional governors across thousands of systems made their own calculations about what Endor meant, and those calculations did not all reach the same conclusion at the same speed. The New Republic was born in the chaotic space between what had ended and what had not yet begun, assembling itself from the Alliance's existing structure and the political traditions of the old Senate and the goodwill of worlds that had watched the Emperor's methods and decided they preferred something else. It was messy and contested and sometimes almost fell apart, and it was also genuinely new. which is both what made it fragile and what made it worth building. Luke Skywalker's place in all of this was complicated in ways he was still working out. He was 23 years old at Endor, and he was the last Jedi and the son of the Emperor's right hand, and the person who had stood in the throne room and chosen not to fight and watched his father choose to be Anakin Skywalker, again in his last minutes. And he was trying to hold all of those things at once, while also having responsibilities in a galaxy reorganizing itself from the ruins of what had been. He thought about what the Jedi Order had been, and what it had failed to be, and where those failures had led, and what he wanted to build in their place. He had the Force, and he had time, and he had the honest understanding of what had gone wrong, which is the most important thing anyone building anything new can begin with. He began searching. He traveled to worlds where the Force was strong, and where history had left traces of what the Jedi had been, and known, and taught. He found artifacts and texts and temple sites that the Emperor's systematic elimination of Jedi culture had not completely reached. And gradually, over the years following Endor, something like a direction began to take shape. The Jedi tradition had not been wrong in its fundamental purpose. Guardians of peace and justice, servants of the light side, beings who had trained themselves to carry extraordinary gifts carefully and use them in service of something larger than themselves. The Order had been wrong in some of its specific practices, in the rigidity that had made it unable to adapt, in the suppression of attachment that had made Anakin Skywalker's love into a vulnerability rather than a foundation. Luke intended to keep what was genuinely true and examine everything else with the honesty that his predecessors had sometimes lacked. 5 years after the Battle of Endor, the threat that arrived was not what anyone had expected. Grand Admiral Thrawn, the last Grand Admiral of the Imperial Fleet, had been on a campaign in the unknown regions when Endor happened, and he returned to the remnants of Imperial power with a plan that was different in character from anything the fragmented Imperial command had attempted since the battle. Thrawn was not a tactician who relied on superior numbers or raw firepower, though he commanded both. He was a student of the beings he fought. He studied their art, the art of the species and cultures he intended to engage, and he used what he found there to understand how they thought and how they would react under pressure. And then he engineered the pressure. He understood the New Republic's political fractures and its military priorities and its emotional commitments, and he struck at each of them in a coordinated campaign that felt, from the inside, like a net drawing tighter from multiple directions at once. Thrawn also had access to something that complicated everything: Isalamiri, creatures from the world of Merca that produced a bubble within which the Force did not operate, where Force-sensitive beings could not feel or use what the Force offered. He deployed them specifically as a counter to Jedi, placing them in strategic locations to neutralize Luke's abilities in environments where they would otherwise have been decisive. And he had an ally that was a different kind of problem entirely. Joruus C'baoth was a clone of the Jedi Master Joruus C'baoth, who had died decades earlier, and cloning had not replicated everything accurately. What it had produced was enormously powerful and deeply, structurally insane. A being whose connection to the Force was genuine and whose relationship to reality was not. C'baoth wanted the Skywalker twins and Leia's unborn children as his to mold into Jedi students. And Thrawn had promised him these things in exchange for his cooperation. And C'baoth's cooperation meant the ability to command fleet engagements through the Force on a scale that no conventional commander could match. Into this situation came Mara Jade. She had been the Emperor's hand, one of his personal operatives, trained from childhood in the Force and in combat, and in moving through galactic society undetected, doing the Emperor's work in spaces where official power could not reach. When the Emperor died at Endor, his last command had traveled through the Force to every agent connected to him. And the last command that reached Mara Jade was to kill Luke Skywalker. She had been carrying that command like a splinter in her consciousness for 5 years, unable to fulfill it and unable to release it. She despised Luke Skywalker with the specific intensity of someone who has decided that one person is responsible for the disruption of everything they knew how to be. She was also, when circumstances required them to work together inside the Emperor's storehouse on Wayland, one of the most effective allies he had ever worked beside. The situation at Wayland was what the entire campaign had been building toward. Thrawn's clone facility there was producing the soldiers his campaign needed, and Sabaoth's madness had become a crisis rather than a resource. And in the chaos of that convergence, Luke found himself back to back with the woman who had been trying to kill him for years, holding together against something that would have killed either of them alone. Sabaoth had done what the dark side always eventually does to someone who uses it without the discipline to contain what it demands. He had also created a clone of Luke Skywalker from the genetic material of the hand lost at Cloud City, a being called Luke who carried Luke's appearance and none of his choices. Mara Jade killed Luke. In destroying the clone that bore Luke Skywalker's face, she discharged the Emperor's last command in the only form that allowed her to release it, and it was done, and she was free of it. Thrawn died on his own flagship, not at Alliance hands, but at his Nogri bodyguard Rooks, a member of the species that had served the Empire under a deception that Leia had uncovered and delivered to them as truth. The Nogri owed their allegiance to the Skywalker bloodline, and Rook made his calculation on his own. The threat that followed was one that Luke had not been prepared for, because it came from a direction he had believed was permanently closed. The Emperor had prepared for his own death with the thoroughness of someone who had thought about it for decades and had no intention of allowing it to be final. Clone bodies had been prepared on the deep core world of Biss, modified to contain Palpatine's dark side energies, and when the Emperor died at Endor, his spirit had traveled to the nearest prepared vessel, and he had continued. He had been rebuilding, and he had been patient. Luke Skywalker went to Biss. He went because he felt the pull of something there, and because he believed that understanding the dark side on its own ground was better than fearing it from a distance. The Emperor received him as a student, and Luke studied under him deliberately, as a choice, believing this was the path through rather than the path away. He was wrong about whether this approach would work, and right that the dark side needed to be engaged rather than avoided. And the line between those two things is thin enough that the distinction only becomes clear in retrospect. It was Leia who reached him. Leia, who shared his blood, and the Force connection that came with it, who came to Biss, knowing where he had gone, and why and what it might cost her, and who walked into the place where the dark side was most concentrated and spoke to her brother in a voice that the dark side had no answer for. What he remembered of himself came back to him through her, and he came back. The Emperor tried again and again, cycling through clone bodies, that the dark side energies deteriorated faster than they could be replaced. And the final attempt to secure his legacy involved reaching toward Anakin Solo, Han, and Leia's infant son, to use the child as a vessel for the Emperor's surviving consciousness. A dying Jedi named Empatogios Brand made the last sacrifice available to him, binding his own Force presence around Palpatine's spirit as his body failed, carrying the Emperor's consciousness with him into whatever lay beyond the Force's physical boundary permanently. Palpatine died for the last time in that moment. The dark side's capacity for resurrection has limits, and he had found them. Luke built the Jedi Praxeum on Yavin 4 in the 11th year after Endor. The choice of location was deliberate in a way that Yavin 4's history made possible. The old rebel base transformed into something new on the same ground. Continuity and change occupying the same space. He gathered students from across the galaxy, Force-sensitive beings who had grown up without any tradition to shape or explain what they carried, who had been navigating extraordinary gifts with no framework and finding the experience isolating and sometimes frightening. He offered them a framework built from what the old Jedi had understood and refined through what the old Jedi had failed to understand. He taught them not to suppress attachment, but to be honest about it. Not to fear the dark side, but to know it well enough that its doorways were recognizable, not to serve the New Republic or any political structure, but to serve something larger than any of them, which was harder to define and more important to pursue. The first crisis at the Praxeum came from below the ground. Exar Kun's spirit had been trapped in the Massassi temples of Yavin 4 for 4,000 years, since the Jedi Civil War, preserved in the dark side energies of the place, in a form that was not quite alive and not quite gone. He found the new students who were new enough to be reached, and he found one student who was both extraordinarily gifted and damaged, in ways that made the dark side's offer feel like repair rather than corruption. Kip Duron had grown up in the spice mines of Kessel, a child prisoner whose family had been destroyed by the Empire, who had Force gifts so large that they had nowhere to go in a spice mine except inward, and who had learned to survive by not needing anything he could not provide himself. Exar Kun fed that isolation everything it wanted to hear about power and justice and the inadequacy of patience. Kype took the Sun Crusher, a superweapon that the New Republic had captured and that Luke had been urging them to destroy, and he used it to annihilate the Carida system, where Imperial stormtroopers were trained, where the academy that had produced the soldiers of the Empire had operated for decades. He killed every living being in that system. He was 20 years old, and he did it believing it was just. Exar Kun also attacked Luke directly, driving him into a Force coma that left him suspended between consciousness and the Force while his students faced both the aftermath of Kype's act and the presence of something ancient and malevolent that their teacher was not available to confront. What happened next was one of the things Luke later described as the most important event in the early Praxeum's history. Not because of what it accomplished, but because of what it demonstrated was possible. His students, most of them barely trained, and none of them ready for what they were facing, chose to act together. They pooled what Force connection they had. Imperfect and incomplete and insufficient by any conventional measure. And they used it to pull Luke back from where he had gone. And then they turned it outward against Exar Kun's spirit and unmade him. 4,000 years of dark side preservation dissolved under the combined intention of students who had been training for months. The old Jedi Order had believed that the dark side could only be countered by exceptional Jedi in individual combat. Luke's Praxeum demonstrated, in its first year, that this might not be the only way. Kip Duron came back. He came back because the Force had not finished with him, and because Luke had the patience for it, And because something in Kip that the dark side had not quite reached responded to the presence of a man who had been in the throne room and thrown his lightsaber away and had still been right. He became a Jedi Knight and one of the most controversial and capable members of the New Order for decades to come, embodying all the tension between power and wisdom that Luke spent his career working to resolve. Mara Jade stayed in Luke's orbit longer than either of them would have predicted in the years when she was trying to kill him. The relationship between them developed with the particular patience of two people who have been through enough together that they no longer need to perform what they feel, who can afford to let understanding arrive at its own pace because they have reason to trust that it will arrive. She was the most capable person he knew who was not his sister. She understood the Force from a direction he had never approached. Through the Emperor's use of it as a tool of personal extension, as something that connected a master's will to agents distributed across the galaxy, and that understanding complemented what Luke had built from the opposite direction. They were married in the 19th year after Endor, in a ceremony that was small and entirely genuine. And what they built together was a partnership in the fullest sense. Two people who made each other better at everything that mattered. Their son was born in the 26th year after Endor, in the middle of the worst crisis the New Republic had faced since the Emperor. The Yuuzhan Vong arrived from beyond the galaxy's edge, an extragalactic species that had spent centuries crossing the void between galaxies in living world ships, and they brought a war that the galaxy's defenses had never been designed to fight. The Yuuzhan Vong existed outside the Force. They did not appear in it, could not be felt through it, could not be touched by it in the ways that conventional living beings could. Their technology was entirely biological, grown rather than built, and it was devastatingly effective against a civilization built around conventional machinery. They targeted the Jedi specifically, and immediately, understanding that eliminating them removed the only asymmetric advantage the galaxy possessed, and they seeded disinformation that turned public sentiment against the Jedi at the precise moment when the Jedi needed public support most. They were sophisticated and ancient, and they had been planning this invasion for longer than the New Republic had existed. The losses were incomprehensible in scale. Chewbacca died in the first months of the war, when a moon was brought down on the world of Cernpidal, dying the way he had lived, protecting the people around him until the last possible moment. And Han Solo carried that loss in a way that Luke recognized from inside his own grief, because he had carried Biggs and Ben and knew there was no way through it except through it. Anakin Solo, Han and Leia's youngest child, the grandson of Darth Vader, died at Murka, leading a mission to destroy a creature the Vong had created specifically to hunt Jedi. He was 16 years old. He died well, which matters, and also does not compensate for dying at 16. His brother Jason was captured and subjected to what the Vong called the embrace of pain, and what was done to him there shaped him in ways that would not become fully visible for another decade. Luke navigated all of this as the head of an order trying to remain functional while the galaxy it served was being consumed from the edges inward. Mara nearly died. A Yuuzhan Vong created disease, found her, and began to take her, and Luke fought for her survival with everything the Force would give him. And she fought for her own survival with everything she was, and they fought it together, and she lived. Their son Ben was born at the height of the war, a child who came into a galaxy on fire and who would grow up in the shadow of what the war had done to his family and his father's students, and the beings he would come to understand were his to protect. The war ended in the 29th year after Endor, on a living planet called Zonama Sekut, that the Yuuzhan Vong recognized as something sacred to their origins, a world that resolved the war's final terms in a way that no military victory could have. 365 trillion beings died in the Yuuzhan Vong War. The number has no emotional purchase, because no human mind is built to hold it. But it sat in Luke Skywalker's awareness for the rest of his life as the thing that had happened on his watch, and he did not allow himself to look away from it. The years after the Vong War were years of rebuilding and a different kind of crisis, slower and more interior. Jacen Solo had come back from captivity changed, and he had then left on a 5-year journey through the galaxy's Force traditions, studying every approach available to him, seeking something he was not willing or able to fully name. He returned in the 40th year after Endor, with a philosophy and a certainty and a willingness to act on both that should have alarmed Luke more than it did. Jacen was brilliant and deeply connected to the Force, and had survived things that would have broken most beings. And Luke loved him with the uncomplicated love that an uncle carries for a nephew he has watched grow from birth. He also had a blind spot around the Solo children, a trust that was not unearned, but that made it harder to see what was happening until it had progressed further than it should have. What was happening was Darth Caedus. Jacen Solo had found his way to the dark side, not through anger or fear in the conventional sense, but through a philosophical conviction that the galaxy needed to be saved from itself, and that he was the being who could do it, and that the cost of what that required was acceptable. He had been shown a vision of a galaxy-ending darkness, and he had concluded that extreme measures taken now would prevent something worse later. And this logic, which the dark side is particularly good at making available, had walked him step by step to a place where he was willing to do things that his 20-year-old self would not have recognized as possible for him. He took the name Darth Caedus. He seized enormous political power within the Galactic Alliance. He made operational decisions that crossed lines in the direction of atrocity, and he justified each crossing with the same calculus about preventing the greater darkness. Mara Jade Skywalker understood what her nephew had become before Luke did. She confronted him directly, in the way she had always confronted things, and Jacen Solo killed her. He killed Mara Jade Skywalker, who had been the Emperor's hand, and the woman who had once been sent to kill Luke, and who had instead built a life with him and borne him a son and stood beside him through everything the galaxy had managed to produce in 4 decades of chaos. Luke felt her die through the Force, in the particular way that you feel the death of someone whose Force presence has been part of your awareness for so long that losing it is also losing a part of your own. He mourned her in the way that private grief happens in public lives, holding it in and letting it inform everything he did without letting it become the only thing he was. He and his son Ben investigated Jacen's fall together, traveling the same path that Jacen had walked in his 5-year journey, trying to understand how it had gone from the seeking of wisdom to the commission of atrocity. Luke needed to understand it not only for Jacen's sake, but for every student he had trained, because if Jacen could fall, then the Praxium's methods needed to be examined with the honesty he had always demanded of himself. Jaina Solo, Jacen's twin sister, was tasked with what needed to be done about Caedus. She trained with Boba Fett, who was still alive and still the best at what he had always been best at, and she learned from him the specific set of skills that her brother's training had not included, and she faced Darth Caedus in a battle that cost them both more than either had available to pay. Jacen Solo died at his twin sister's hands in the 40th year after Endor, and the galaxy went on. The political consequences of Kaidos and the war that had formed around him left Luke in a position that he had not sought and could not easily escape. The Galactic Alliance, trying to demonstrate that Jedi were subject to the same accountability as everyone else, issued an order exiling him from Coruscant and charging him with negligence for failing to stop Kaidus's fall. Luke accepted this, not because he believed the charge was fair in the terms it was stated, but because he understood what it was actually asking for, which was an accounting for how someone trained under his supervision had become Darth Kaidus. He owed that accounting. He and Ben left Coruscant together and retraced Jacen's steps with the intention of understanding what had been available to Jacen at each point that might have led somewhere other than where he had gone. What they found on that journey was Abeloth. She was ancient in a way that made the distinction between historical and mythological meaningless. A being who had existed long before recorded history could reach. She had been mortal once. A woman who had served the Ones, that family of Force beings, representing light and dark, and the balance between them. And she had been the mother figure who kept the son and daughter from tearing everything apart. She aged while they remained eternally young, and fear of losing them and fear of death led her to do what the afraid and desperate do. She had drunk from both the font of power and the pool of knowledge, breaking the rules she had been warned to follow. And what was released by that combination had been imprisoned for eons. Now the prison was not holding. Abeloth could wear faces and voices and move through systems built to scan for conventional threats. Luke fought her multiple times across the journey, in physical confrontations and in Force realm battles that happened at depths of consciousness, where the rules of ordinary engagement did not apply. She was not like any dark side entity he had faced, because she was not the dark side in the form he had been trained to recognize. She had been born from love and desperation rather than ambition and hatred. And those origins gave her a relationship to living beings that the conventional dark side did not share. The battles with Abeloth were among the most difficult of Luke Skywalker's life, requiring him to extend his understanding of the Force into territory that Yoda and Obi-Wan had never mapped, trusting what the Force showed him in spaces with no prior guidance and no guarantee of return. He also faced, in one of those deeper realms, the surviving echo of Palpatine's consciousness. The Emperor had been truly destroyed when Empatogeos Brand carried him beyond the Force's physical boundary. But the dark side's relationship with permanence is complicated, and what Luke found was not Palpatine returned, but a residue at the level of the Force where such things can persist longer than bodies. This confrontation was not a duel in any physical sense. It was a reckoning, a meeting of what Luke Skywalker had become across 40-odd years of choices and losses and decisions to keep going against the architectural intention of the man who had spent decades shaping the galaxy around his own design. He had Anakin's last choice, and Obi-Wan's voice, and Yoda's patience, and Mara's love, and Ben's existence, and 40 years of students who had chosen to be Jedi rather than fall away, and the shadow of Palpatine dissolved in the presence of all of that. Luke Skywalker returned from exile and resumed his position as Grand Master of the Jedi Order. He was in his late 50s by then, not old by the standards of beings who can channel the Force the way he had learned to do, and he carried his years as weight that had become familiar rather than burden that had become unbearable. The order he led bore no resemblance to the Order Yoda had been Grand Master of before Order 66. It was smaller and more diverse, and willing to examine its own assumptions with the honesty that his predecessors had sometimes lacked. It made mistakes the old order had not made, and avoided mistakes the old order had made repeatedly, which is what growth looks like when it is genuine. Luke's students trained their own students, and the lineage of teaching that Obi-Wan Kenobi had begun in a desert hut on Tatooine continued to extend itself outward through the galaxy, in the way that lineages do when the thing being passed down is worth passing down. He thought about his father. He thought about Anakin Skywalker often, in the way that you think about someone who gave you both your life and the most difficult understanding you ever had to carry. He had stood in the throne room and believed in the good that remained in a man who had done unforgivable things. And he had been right. And the cost of being right had been everything Anakin had left to pay. He carried that moment not as proof that redemption was always available, but as evidence that the Force continued to offer it beyond the point where most beings believed the offering had stopped. This was perhaps the most dangerous thing he had ever believed, and the most important. And he held both of those qualities simultaneously, which is the kind of holding that only becomes possible after enough years. Luke Skywalker had been a farm boy from a desert planet who flew through Beggar's Canyon on instinct and looked up at twin suns on summer evenings and felt the distance between himself and everything he did not yet know he was. He had been the pilot who closed his eyes in a trench and trusted the Force to place the shot. He had been the student who walked into a cave and found his own face in a vision. He had been the son who stood in his father's final minutes and refused to leave. He had been the teacher who rebuilt a tradition from fragments and failure and the honest assessment of what had gone wrong. He had been the husband who felt his wife die through the Force and kept going because she would have demanded nothing less. He had been the father who raised a son in the middle of a war and tried to give him something worth inheriting. He had been wrong about important things and right about more important things, and he had done the work of correcting the first and maintaining the second with the consistency of someone who had decided a long time ago that the galaxy was worth the effort. The Force had been with him in the way the Force is with all living things, not as a guarantee of outcomes, but as a current available to those willing to open themselves to it, patient with all of them.